The deadline for Canadian businesses to qualify for partial loan forgiveness of pandemic era loans has now passed, even though business groups warn that struggling firms need more time to repay their debt. Hundreds of thousands of businesses and nonprofits received the Canada Emergency Business Account Loan of up to $60,000 during the COVID-19 pandemic. Up to one-third of those loans could be forgiven if the outstanding amount was repaid by January 18th. But for those who didn't pay or could not pay, the debt is converted into a 3-year loan with a 5% annual interest. And while business groups in Canada have loudly complained, some have argued that Canadian businesses don't really have much to complain about. Joining us now is one of those voices, Lauren Heuser, publisher and editor of Canadian Affairs. Lauren, thank you very much for being back with us on Forum Daily.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
So, in your view, why is it that the business community shouldn't be complaining about the CEBA loan repayment deadline?
I think it's important to be clear about what that deadline entailed. The January 18th deadline was not a date by which loan holders had to pay or repay the principal loan balance. It was the date by which they had to repay the loan if they wanted to qualify for partial loan forgiveness. Those businesses that haven't met that deadline are now simply subject to interest going forward, which is what they would have been subject to if they had obtained a loan in the marketplace. And that those loans are subject to a 5% interest rate. And so at most 5% on a $60,000 loan is $3,000 a year in interest charges or $250 a month. It's hard to believe that that would drive waves of businesses into default.
Yeah. And what do you make of the argument that because these were pandemic loans, right, they were given out because in many instances, government forced these companies to close? Is there an argument to be made here that the government, whether that be federal or provincial, has an obligation to bail these businesses out because it was ultimately their decision to shut these businesses down?
Mhm. I do think there was an obligation for the government to provide those loans during the pandemic. They were the ones who ordered the shutdowns, which resulted in many businesses seeing their revenue plummet while they
hmm
had fixed expenses like rent or salaries. And it would have been impossible to obtain or very difficult to obtain loans from banks in those circumstances. So, given the unusual circumstances, it made sense that government offered those loans, but we're well past the pandemic, and it makes sense to me that going forward, these businesses should pay interest if they can't uh, pay the loan, which was already subject to the very preferential partial
Yeah.
loan forgiveness.
And how many businesses so far have that received CEBA loans have repaid them?
Mhm. So the government has said nearly 900,000 small businesses and not-for-profits received CEBA loans, and
hmm
it estimates that of those 900,000, three quarters, or about 675,000 businesses have repaid in full by the January deadline. So that leaves about 220,000 businesses that haven't repaid the loans.
And so, in terms of the nitty gritty here and the specifics, can you walk us through the specifics for loan forgiveness in the program? Because in your editorial, you cite that even with repayment, taxpayers could be looking at a $9 billion subsidy to businesses.
Mhm. So the partial loan forgiveness was so loan holders who received between $40,000 and $60,000 from Ottawa
hmm
were entitled to receive between a quarter and one-third of their loans forgiven if they met that January 18th deadline. And so on a $40,000 loan, if you had a quarter forgiven, it'd be $10,000 that the loan holder gets to pocket. If it was 60,000, you get to pocket $20,000.
hmm
And so you can do the math. The government has said 49 billion is the total loan value provided to all loan holders. So estimating that on the conservative side, all of those loan holders received 25% forgiveness, you can arrive at the conservative estimate that $9 billion has been transferred to small businesses by Ottawa and really
Yeah.
taxpayers.
Yeah, and that is a substantial sum of money, especially in the context of overall government finances. And we're back with Lauren Heuser. We're talking about the CEBA loan repayment debate. Lauren, we know that the interest rate is 5%. How does that compare to market rates for loans of this size? Would these businesses be able to qualify for loans at that rate in the private sector?
Not today. The Canada Central Bank's current overnight rate is 5%.
Hmm.
And that rate is the rate at which the central bank lends money to the major commercial banks who necessarily set their interest rates above that overnight rate so that they themselves earn a profit from lending to businesses and individuals. So we know that small businesses, if they were to try and get a loan today, could not get a rate of 5%. And so that's another factor that really suggests the CEBA program is quite favorable for businesses.
And walk us through what the argument of the business community is here, because we have seen headlines across the country about that deadline. We saw it in the lead up to it, and we've seen it after. What has been their argument here, that the terms of the loan are either unfair or that the deadline needs to continue to be extended?
Mhm. Well, there's many arguments being made. The long and short of it is that this puts them in a position of hardship if they are required to, I guess, pay interest or in several years repay the loan balance. But I do think this is a case of potentially kind of overstatement or hysteria by both the media industry and industry organizations, because I think if you really walk through the math, you can't make a compelling case, in my view, that they're being poorly treated by this program. There are of course always businesses that are struggling, and I think a lot of the media have managed to speak to some of those businesses that are struggling and will struggle even more if they have to pay an additional 3,000 in expenses. But not every business succeeds. Not every business has a successful business model,
Yep.
and I think it's hard to point to the pandemic as the reason anymore.
Yeah, and it certainly varies by industry. Different
Mhm.
industries were impacted differently by the pandemic in terms of their ability to remain open in any functional way, versus others. I want to ask you a question about the potential for nefariousness or possibly fraud here. So correct me if I'm wrong. A business gets a $60,000 loan, they repay that loan, and a portion of it is written off, and the business gets to keep the cash. Was that means tested in any way to ensure that it was only businesses who absolutely needed it who got that money, or could in theory have and had could any business apply for it and then simply walk away with the cash after repaying the loan?
I don't know. I really can't speak to what means testing
Yeah.
happened, or what the criteria for eligibility was. I do know that the business industry has said that of the three quarters of businesses that have repaid their loans by the January deadline, a significant portion, I think a third of those people who have repaid have actually refinanced their loans with other organizations, recognizing that it's better to pay interest to another lender if you at least get the partial loan forgiveness of between one quarter and one third of the value of the loan. And that's not nefarious. That's, I think, just being strategic.
Yeah, but that would essentially be getting a loan to pay for the government loan in order to have the
Yes.
forgiveness. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And the industry has said that a significant portion of businesses have done that.
Yes, and I guess if you create the incentives for that type of write-off, in terms of forgiveness, you're certainly creating a scenario where businesses will try to achieve that. Lauren, I really appreciate you taking the time today to sit down with us. And yeah, thank you. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here, David.